Figuring out your land base can be tedious. I already have all my duels, shocks, fetches, the relevant channel and bond lands, and a few 5 colors to round things out. But my 27th land, the one separating me from the animals in cEDH, is still up in the air. I've narrowed it down to a few mono blue options, and upon asking my friends for their opinion, I was met with, well, it depends.
Yeah, of course it does, but what does it depend on? Today, I want to dive a little bit further into the pros and cons of the mono blue utility lands that I've narrowed my 27th land choice down to, just in case you have also had this dilemma and thought, wow, that looks like a lot of work. I'm sure there are a lot of moving parts in there. Man, and it's really not even going to come up that often, so why?
First, let's look at Cephalid Coliseum. Its pros and cons are pretty straightforward. The biggest pro is that you can kill someone attempting to win the game with Thoracle,
Which is objectively the funniest time to kill someone.
by forcing them to draw cards once their library is empty. The con is that it's not even consistent in situations like that, as you need Threshold to activate it, which for many decks is not a given. While it's in play functioning as a land, it's a strictly worse island as you take 1 damage when you tap it for mana. As far as tutor ability is concerned, it's leagues above the others if you can get it off of crop rotation, as you can get that surprise factor kill onto a Thoracle player, but if you're using Archdruid's Charm, it's pretty useless since it comes in tapped unless you're really gearing up for someone to silence the table and rip that specific win. Manamo School at Water's Edge has a really niche interaction that's making people pick back up on it, which is untapping the One Ring. That's the broad strokes use, and if you have a second legendary card with a tap ability, then this card is twice as good. The cons are that of all my niche land options, this one feels the most niche. The second is the consistent resource investment from both a life and mana perspective. Tutor ability for this combination is also rather questionable, as it's situational whether One Ring Manamo will even be better for you than a Rhystic Study.
And before you say something like, oh, what if I don't play Rhystic Study? We're talking about blue lands. You play Rhystic Study.
The final special land that I've considered is Seagate Reborn, the back half of Seagate Restoration. The pros: it's tutorable off of Mystical Tutor, which feels like it comes up more in mulligan situations than any time in the mid-game. Another pro: it's a castable spell. You can also pitch it to Chrome Mox, Force of Will, and Force of Negation. The cons: you're never casting this fucking spell.
This really feels like the magic equivalent of the rotting bananas in your freezer. You're not making banana bread. Just stop.
You can't pitch it to Mox Diamond. Being pitchable to Force doesn't even really feel like it should count as a pro, since every blue card can do that, but since we're looking at this like a land, I guess I can let it slide, though I'm not super happy about it. Similarly, not being able to play this in an ad nauseam deck doesn't feel like a real con, but we'll count it. The basic island. Con: it's a basic island. My biggest issue with this card is that in the 2 situations where having it can come up, you want to draw it in one of them and you don't in the other. If you like having a basic land to tutor if your opponents hit you with a Path to Exile or Assassin's Trophy, then drawing this card completely defeats the purpose of putting it in your deck. On the other hand, if your opponent plays a Blood Moon, this suddenly becomes the most valuable land you could possibly draw. The bad news is that if you're looking at this through the lens of someone who doesn't play red, then one basic land sometimes still isn't enough to function under Blood Moon. Going back to Path Assassin's Trophy, how popular are these cards? Is this ever even going to come up?
I figured Tivit was the most likely deck to run Path to Exile, so I went and took a look at the 32 Tivit decks that have made top 4 in the last 5 months. And of those 32, 19 of them, or about 60%, were running Path to Exile. Then I went and looked at Atraxa because I feel like that's the deck most likely to run Assassin's Trophy. And of the 17 Atraxa that have top 8'd in the last 5 months, only 2 of them were running Assassin's Trophy. And you might be wondering, Boulevard, why'd you stop at 17 for Atraxa? That's such an odd number. That's just how long it took me to find the second Assassin's Trophy. And at that point, it kind of felt like the point had been made.
So now it's time to use that list of pros and cons to determine which is right for you. Here's my thought process as it pertains to my current deck, Dargo Thrasios.
The worst of these options for me feels like the basic island. With Assassin's Trophy mostly out of the picture, I have to ask myself, am I the deck that's going to get hit with the Path to Exile? And as a Dargo Thrasios player, the answer definitely feels like no, almost never. Unless you're hitting my Tidespout Tyrant, at which point I was already attempting to win the game anyways, so a basic island isn't really going to make me feel any better. On top of that, when we talk about Blood Moon, I am a deck with red in it, so I already inherently function under Blood Moon kind of okay. And then I don't have access to my double green pips anyway, which the island isn't going to help me out with. Yeah, I could open up like Chain of Vapor, Otawara, but ultimately I just don't even see Blood Moon that often, and so it feels like it's a little bit too niche. On top of all of this, I already run Tidespout Tyrant as a card that I do not want to draw, and so adding a second card that I do not want to draw in the basic island just kind of feels like it's going to create some tilting experiences over the course of an event where I draw both of them and it makes the hand unkeepable because these are so much better in my deck, or something along those lines where I'm just like having a bad day and I draw the island and it just sets me over the edge. I'm also not going to take Manamo. I feel like I need a second legendary permanent to make Manamo really worth it. And yes, I have One Ring. I liked it more when I tried Selvala. I felt like with Selvala One Ring, yes, okay, I will try Manamo now. This kind of puts it over the edge for me. I do run Gaia's Cradle, but the idea that I'm ever going to pay 2 blue mana for an activation of Gaia's Cradle, it feels more realistic to me that I am going to draw Manamo and the One Ring together. Seagate Restoration is Seagate Restoration is also out, but barely. This one was actually a lot more appealing than I initially thought it was. Because my deck draws cards in large bursts, like Life's Legacy, I find myself discarding down a few times every event or so. And the idea that I can hold my land slot and my pitch to force slot when discarding down in the same card is actually quite appealing. If this card could be tutored off Spellseeker, I think I actually would have picked Seagate Restoration, so much so that I started questioning if this land really had to be blue and started looking at Shatter Skull Smashing. I'm not in love with it, but for me, Cephalid Coliseum is going to be my pick. I love the idea that I can kill a Thoracle player on the stack. I understand that I do have to be a little more intentional about it because Atraxa, if they play it out, can leave some number of cards in their library. Talion doesn't really have that sort of affordability, but I think that this win condition is common enough that if I draw this card, I will find myself in a situation where I'm happy about it, but I do have to consciously play with it and, not tap my worst land first, sort of like I'm used to. But we haven't even mentioned the fact that I can just target myself to draw 3, discard 3 at some point in the match. But I don't feel like that's going to come up that often. Again, I don't feel like any of these abilities are going to come up that often.
I say the most potential, but I want you to keep in mind that we're likely talking about the difference between a 0.5% chance, 0.75% chance, and a 1% chance. And it's totally possible that the 0.5% chance thing comes up 2 or 3 times over the course of a tournament, and the others never do. Something like this isn't really quantitative because your sample size is always going to be too small, and so you have to base it on vibes. In the worst case scenario for each of these lands, what's the worst? Well, the worst case is that I play them as a land, in which case Cephalid or Seagate are the worst depending on how early I have to play it and how long the game goes. In the best case scenario, what's the best? Cephalid kills a player trying to win the game, Manamo snowballs a game, Seagate's best case scenario is probably not even being played as a land at all.
Stop fooling yourself. You're not going to cast Seagate Restoration.
And the island gives me a rather minor payoff for something of mine being killed by an opponent, or potentially swings a game by opening me up to Chain of Vapor or Otawara through Blood Moon. Of all of these, though, Cephalid seems to have the best case scenario that's going to come up most often, as decks like Atraxa and Talion are still primarily winning the game through Thassa's Oracle. Now, I do have to be mindful of shortcutting things, as the Atraxa player can leave cards in deck if they're winning through Food Chain, and I also have to get out of the habit of tapping my worst land for mana first and play this land a little more intentionally. Anyway, if you currently are or ever have been in a situation like this, I hope this helped.